You're watching CTV News Channel on this Monday afternoon. I'm Todd Vanderheiden. True North Politics is back with some major trade news that Donald Trump has signed off on an agreement separately with Mexico, a new trade agreement, and that he is going to be dropping the NAFTA name. So is it the end of NAFTA as we know it? By the way, Canada not part of this deal. The president says he will negotiate with Canada separately and that a deal could be simple, but it might well be a take it or leave it approach, something Donald Trump, of course, is legendary for. And Canada, despite what the Canadian government is saying today, could now be at a distinct disadvantage going one-to-one with such a heavyweight like the United States. Let's bring in our True North Politics commentators. From the NDP point of view, Tom Parkin is joining us. For the Liberals, we've got Jeff Turner rounding things out, the editor-in-chief of the Toronto Sun, Adrian Batra, who I am going to start with. Adrian, what do you make of this?
Well, let's go back to many years ago when then candidate Trump was coming down those infamous escalators and he declared that he was going to renegotiate NAFTA and rip up all these trade contracts. At the time, I'd said on your show many, many times, we in Canada don't have anything to worry about because candidate Trump's issues were not with north of the border on NAFTA, it was south of the border. Well, now fast forward to 2018, almost the end of the summer, and I'm very concerned that President Trump's issue with NAFTA is north of the border and not south of the border. We should be very troubled that we are not at the table. We should be very worried, not only from an economic perspective, but also from a larger perspective when Canada wants to move ahead and actually renegotiate or new negotiations with other trade deals. This is problematic. We look weak. Whether that's a fair assessment or not, we do, unfortunately, right now. I know that Minister Freeland and Prime Minister Trudeau have, at their very best, given a valiant effort, but it hasn't been good enough. They should have changed their tactics dealing with Donald Trump weeks ago, and now we see the Mexicans getting their deal, and we're not there yet.
So, Jeff, let me ask you this question, how this is going to play out, because we're hearing some very serious threats today from Trump again against the Canadian auto sector, saying, listen, we'll just bring in tariffs. They're going to be very expensive for Canada if they don't get the message. And the auto sector is just one out of three that he has identified. He keeps talking about the dairy sector being too protected in our country, blocking American farmers, also lumber as well. I mean, is it time for the federal government to start drawing up a list of concessions? Is that where this is going to go?
So, Tom, I think it's today certainly has seen some movement over the last number of months. It didn't seem clear where this was heading, and I think today we see this as either the beginning of the end or the end of the beginning. But in either way, we are turning a chapter into the next phase of this, and I think Canadians are very much expecting their leaders and the Trudeau government to stand up for the best interests of Canadians. And I don't think capitulating to Donald Trump's tactics or his bullying on certain subjects is going to achieve that, because I don't know if we will be able to achieve the best deal for Canadians if you are just simply trying to follow what is obviously a very dynamic administration in Washington. Not to undermine, this is a very important development today. I know the Canadian officials and leadership are going to be taking this in stride, but also pushing forward with that next round of negotiations. They are quite clear in saying this is a part of the process, that Canada is required to be a part of this agreement. Their signature is required on this. And let's not lose sight of, if Donald Trump could rip up NAFTA, he would have done it a while ago. He needs congressional authority, and I think the Canadian government's been doing a very good job over the last year and change in doing that important groundwork of going to see the right audiences, having both the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Prime Minister speaking to the right audiences, seeing outreach to congressional and state-level leadership. I think that ground game will pay off in the end, and but today is certainly the opening of a new chapter.
All right. And Tom, I want to get your read on this, because if we're talking about a take it or leave it approach, where does that leave Canada? And again, this very unrealistic timeline that the Americans have put out. They want to deal with Canada by the end of the week. In other words, in 4 days or so, which would seem to be mission impossible.
Yeah, I think the most important thing when you're talking about Mr. Trump and what's going on in the United States is to not let him rattle us. And to some extent, that's what's happening today with all these apparently contradictory ideas that he throws out about, potentially a bilateral agreement or changing the name and all these kind of things. I think everybody should just be calm and carry on. Look, there was a discussion that was happening between Mexico and the United States because the wages in Mexican factories owned by American companies, the big three auto manufacturers, the wages were being suppressed. Mexican workers did not benefit from NAFTA in auto plants in its, 15 years. We've got a new president coming in Mexico. He's a left-winger. He's not interested in he's against the so-called, what he calls the mafia power of the pre-existing governments and this kind of the way that it's suffocated Mexico's economy and the benefits for workers. So, the idea of the discussion between Mexico and the United States on the issue of Mexican wages in American-owned companies is not an odd thing to happen. And that there was communication ongoing between Mexican officials and Canadians should give us some relief. The fact is, if we have a raise in Mexican wages, that's good for Mexican workers, good for Mexicans, and it's good for Canadian American workers as well, because we've been put into a terrible wage competition system with a wage suppression economy. So I think we should just, everybody should take a chill pill,
right.
Todd, and we should just see what happens the next couple of days. I don't think the bilateral thing was necessarily a bad issue, a bad format, but and it's good that it seems to be a deal struck that will be helpful to Mexican workers. So let's go forward now.
All right, we'll see how that plays out. But I want to, we still have the three of you with us, get to this other story playing out involving Maxime Bernier, so-called Mad Max, going rogue, wants to start his own party, leaving the Conservatives. A bit of an embarrassing turn of events for the party just before their big convention in Halifax. And something interesting, a new survey conducted by polling firm Abacus Data. We're going to bring it up, and it gives you a sense of where things could potentially be if Max Bernier, for example, had his own party right now. 13%. That's more than the Bloc Québécois, more than the Greens added together, and very close, in fact, to the NDP. Adrienne Batra, what do you think?
Bigger problem for the NDP than it certainly is for the Conservatives, because Maxime Bernier is going to be a flash in the pan within the course of the next few months. Most Canadians will forget that this entire bun fight even happened. The Conservatives just came off a very successful policy convention over the weekend. They are united. They are ready to take on the Trudeau Liberals in 2019. The big question mark remains whether or not Maxime Bernier is prepared to accept and move on himself. I suspect that he will be over a course of period of time when he comes to realize, Todd, that it takes a lot to form a party, get money, get grassroots support, get volunteers, and get that work done. I think over the course of the next few weeks, those questions will be more put to Maxime Bernier about what you're doing versus to Andrew Scheer about having this sort of this attempt by Bernier. But those poll numbers, if we believe them, is far more problematic for the NDP.
What do you think, Jeff?
Well, I think on the polling number issue, I mean, it's still very early days, and we'll have to see how that develops over time and the amount of resonance that Mr. Bernier's message gets across the country over the coming months, especially as the parliamentary calendar resumes. But make no mistake, I think the Conservatives did their level best to deal with a very challenging situation with that happening on the eve of their policy convention, and they did a very solid effort trying to put a shine on it and trying to discredit Mr. Bernier. But the fact remains, he certainly threw a very hard pitch at them on the eve of what was supposed to be a very big coming out party for them over the coming year as we approach the election. I think when it comes to Mr. Bernier, the second thing that I know that I've been hearing quite a bit in the days since is the absence of a member of parliament or perhaps affiliated MLAs from other provinces or other party apartchiks standing behind him and defecting with him. I think the interesting part of that is, Mr. Bernier seems to be very much going after the world outside of the Ottawa bubble, and I think he's after the hearts and minds of conservative-leaning, libertarian-leaning, which is a significant portion of the conservative base, individuals across the country, whether that's on Facebook, on Twitter, which he is a very adept user of,
right,
in terms of spreading his message that way. So I think he's looking for those people out there. He's not looking for the people inside the Beltway. And either way you cut it, this is bad news for the Conservatives. It is bad news for Andrew Scheer, who is not looking like he has a great handle on his party, and it's not looking good because it chips away at a very active part of the Conservative base, who I think have a real question now about whether their ideas and their values are reflected in the modern Conservative Party, or whether somebody like Mad Max has more appeal. And certainly, as he made the case in his remarks last week, is certainly very focused on being an ideas person.
All right, last word to you.
We'll leave the discussion about the ideas later.
Tom, last word to you on this. We got about 30 seconds.
Yeah, well, obviously, when you look at a poll and you see that 13% is going to go to some new far-right party, and that would come mostly at the expense of the Conservatives, dropping them into the 20s in public support, the Conservative Party knows it has a problem on its hands. Doubly so because what's happened is that in response to Mad Max's anti-diversity tweets, Mr. Scheer has proclaimed his newfound love of diversity, which maybe somebody like me might like, but it's very far from proven that most conservative voters actually like diversity in Canada. There seems to be a lot of polling evidence that they are quite opposed to it.
That is absurd, Tom.
That is
an absolutely absurd and irresponsible thing to say.
So it really puts the
That is
wedge. So it really puts the wedge into the Conservative Party where it hurts, and he knows that. So here's the opportunity for Jagmeet Singh. He is the person who can unequivocally be starting to push Mr. Trudeau to say, on issues of discrimination, Mr. Bernier's new whatever party, and Mr. Scheer are going to be very poor, very weak, or opposed on that. Mr. Trudeau has mostly been about gesture. But there are important things that need to be done. We still have discrimination against First Nations kids on education, health, and welfare. We don't have wage discrimination laws protecting women. So there's a lot of work to be done here in Canada. So I think Singh's line, as this issue now becomes focused on, is to push Mr. Trudeau harder to fulfill the idea of what diversity is supposed to be about, which is a discrimination-free country.
We're going to have to leave it there, but I know there's going to be a lot more rock and roll to come between the two of you, Adrian and Tom. Thanks for this, and Jeff, great to have you on board as well today. We appreciate all three of you coming on CTV as usual.
Thanks, Todd.
Thanks.